does being a trance channel mean? Well, I've always loved channeled material. That's what I read from the time I was in my 20s. And I grew up in a spiritualist household. So we had seances every Saturday night in my house when I was a kid. We had our house exorcised when I was about 10 because one of the spirits wouldn't leave. So I've always grown up in this kind of environment, and I kind of think that that was why I was born into that family, was because it was part of my training program. Being a trance channel is a couple of things. I felt like I'd won the spiritual lottery when I started to channel because that was all I read. That was the kind of information I valued myself. And I knew how unusual it was. And I'd been, struggling with different career choices. And how old was I when I started to channel? I was, it was 2012, so I was 54. And I was looking for the next phase of my life, really, and little did I know what it was going to be, and it was amazing. I think I have the best job in the world, actually. It's very much like when you wake up from a dream and you can remember a bunch of the dream, and then within 3 or 4 minutes you're like, oh, what was that dream again? And then by coffee time it's gone. So for me, when I come out of a channeling situation, I know what they talked about. Well, it depends. If they've been channeling for an hour, I won't remember everything. But it's very similar to that, waking up from a dream, and then sometimes someone will say something and I'll be like, oh right, they talked about that, but it's not in my present memory. It's not like in my short-term memory. And then it's gone. Like I think they blank slate me basically, because most of it I don't remember. Most of it I don't remember. When I listen to a channeling, I'm like, oh, that's really good. I mean, obviously when it's going through my consciousness, it's having an effect on me. They actually told me one time that when I'm channeling, I'm not aging. No, well, it makes sense though, because they are using my body and my voice. It's not me using it. So I guess it's kind of like a timeout from my life, I suppose, yeah. Yeah, it's like sitting in the back seat of a car when someone else is driving. You can really pay attention to what the driver's doing, or you could look out of the window. I'll be in the back and often they'll talk about something and I'll be like, oh, people won't like that. But I'm just, my consciousness is complete, but it's removed. So I can really pay attention to what they're saying if I want to. If they're getting onto a tricky subject, sometimes I'll pay more attention, because that's sort of like, oh, I wonder what people are going to think about this. But if they're in the middle of a lecture, I'm not that present. But I'm not, I was listening to Ramtha, Jay-Z Knight speaking about Ramtha, and she is literally gone somewhere else. I am completely, they're in complete charge of me, but I'm still there. Well, when they come in, I say they enter, because it's the back of the second chakra. So I get a feeling right in the back of the second chakra, and often when you watch me channel, you'll see me do that, and that's the energy going up my spine. So if they want to say something, if I'm like in a situation like this where I'm talking to somebody, if they want to say something, I'll feel them. I'll be like, oh, they're here. So that's how they let me know they're here. And in the early days when I first started, if I was doing something they didn't want me to do, I would get that feeling, and I'd be like, oh, yeah, they're here. They don't like, because I was watching TV shows they didn't want me to watch, and I was consuming food and drinks they didn't want me to eat. So that was how they let me know they were there. When they first came through, there were two distinct streams of information. There was the book, because they started channeling Making Love to God almost immediately. And then there was all the information for me. So for example, they said I needed to slow down my eating and eat half as much. I was watching a TV show at the time that was, kind of like a murder mystery show, and they didn't like me. They told me to stop watching that early on, where they were telling me to do things. And I'm a super independent person, don't like being told what to do. So there were a couple of times I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to buy a big bag of chips and watch that show. And it was quite funny. Ananda is a group consciousness that are my guides and teachers. And when I first, so Ananda means bliss. That's actually what it means. And that was the experience I had for a month before they made written contact. So I knew I was having a Kundalini awakening, and I was in a state of Ananda. I was in a state of bliss for a month. So that's their name, and they're my guides and teachers. Their purpose is to assist us in our ascension process. And when they first came through, I had a vision, and they said, this is the essence of who we are. And I saw about 8 Indian-looking gurus with long beards and turbans, and I also saw a Native American chief with a big blue and white feather headdress. And they said, this is not who we are, this is the essence of who we are. So that's how they introduce themselves. Well, in the early days, I started to have light experiences. So what happened was I'd been a Course in Miracles student for 12 years at this point. So I had a very strong Course in Miracles practice. And I had an issue with a family member that was really bothering me and interfering with my peace of mind. And I decided, I was like, I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to get this out of my mind. I'm going to do intense. So I started to do like what I consider intense forgiveness practice, where every time this person showed up in my mind, I would pray for it to be healed. I'd hand it over. But I was doing walking meditations. I had always struggled with body image and that kind of thing, body dysmorphia. So one of the things that the Course talks about is this idea of the body being used as a communication device. So one of the prayers I kept saying was, please transform me into a perfect communication device for God. So I would say this prayer over and over with the forgiveness prayers. And so it was a very intense time. Before the Kundalini event happened, I had been doing super intense focused mind practice. And I had read a book called Spiritual Emergency, and it was about Westerners having spontaneous Kundalini awakenings. And basically what it says is a Kundalini awakening comes when you are extremely focused. So yogis, when they're doing their focused practice, that's what they're doing. They're quieting their mind and they're getting that single pointed focus. And the purpose is to reach this other level of consciousness. That's why they're doing it, right? So I think what was happening with me is I was reaching this extremely focused point with prayer and meditation. I was doing it all the time and saying this prayer, please make me a perfect communication device for God. Not with any intention of it being channeling. That wasn't my intention. It was just so that I would not suffer with my body, because I was suffering with my body. So, being a student for 12 years, doing this very, very intense practice, and then right before the Kundalini awakening happened, I started to have light experiences where I'd be outside and it'd be a gray day like it is now, but I'd see sort of sparkles in the sky, and I'd be like, oh, that's interesting. And then one night I was in my bedroom and there were these like little fairies or something in the dark, and I would say they weren't in the room, but they were in my visual field. I knew that they weren't in the room. I knew they weren't little beings in the room. And essentially, I just laid down one day for a nap and all heaven broke loose. I was going to say all hell broke loose, but it wasn't. So I was a very, very dedicated Course student, done it for 12 years, was saying these very intense prayers and meditations. So I was not, and I'd read, before the Course, I'd read many spiritual books. It'd been my whole life, really. So when it started to happen, I knew exactly what it was. I knew what was happening. So I knew that I was in an amazing, loving place. And so I fully surrendered to it. I didn't have any fear at all. Yeah, I think the 5 years prior to my awakening, I was in a training program. I worked up on a very remote ranch about 3 or 4 years before I channeled. And I had to face all of my fears of the dark, all of my fears of being alone. I walked with a gun. There were wild animals. It was 4 feet of snow would fall overnight. I was on a mountain by myself. And when I came down from that job, I was there for 10 months, I think. I was really fearless because I had faced all these fears. And when I started to channel, I kind of recognized, I was like, oh, I'm fearless. Like that was what the ranch was for. It was to train me out of all of these fears, the dark, being alone. Is there an axe murderer on, it was a very intense experience. And people would say to me, like guys who came up to the ranch, they'd say, I don't know how you're doing this. Like, I would be too scared to do this. They said, how are you doing this, living up there by yourself? And I would say, God put me here. So I was, many years into doing the course at that point. So there were certain things. So there was that. And then for a year after that, I painted full-time for a year because they fired me and gave me a nice severance check. So I painted using the severance check. And then I did a year of bioenergy healing training where I was studying for 12 months to clear chakras. And I had tons and tons of sessions on me. I did tons of sessions on people. So when I look back, I'm like, oh, that was all leading up to. So it wasn't like an isolated event. It was definitely a training program. They said the first thing that happens with people when any kind of energy shift happens in their body, they go to sickness. I've got MS, or I'm going to have a seizure or something. They go to insanity and possession. So these are all strong programs in our society. The sickness program, obviously, after the last few years, it's clear that that's a big, powerful program. The church is, the church being, historically the Catholic Church, but this idea of possession. And now that's taken over with horror movies. So the church has lost its influence. Horror movies now scare people, right? Anything happens that's a little bit off, you've watched a Twilight Zone or The Exorcist or something. And insanity, because a lot of people who had spiritual awakenings were put into mental asylums. So when people have an experience of something that they can't understand, most likely they'll go to sickness first. And then and most people have watched those kinds of shows over and over and over again. Even if they're not doing it now, they did when they were teenagers, So one of I was actually talking to this about to a friend of mine recently is I never have I'm 65 now. For 50 years, I've never watched anything scary, anything to do with possession, ghosts. I won't watch it. And it was 100% no. And I think in some ways it was a preparation for this work. So I didn't have any dark images in my mind. I didn't have any scary stories. So for 50 years, I never watched anything. And if I was at a friend's house, for example, and they're like, oh, I'm going to watch this show, and it was a scary show, I'll go, well, you've got a choice. If you want to watch it, I'm leaving. In hindsight, I think that was to keep my mind free of that frequency, because I was going to do this work, right? They talk frequently about the lowering of frequency by watching shows like Dexter, where you've got a show that's actually focused on death, but you've got great characters, great love story, Grey's Anatomy is a good example. It's all about heart attacks and people sick, House, all of these medical shows. The story is about death and sickness, but they make us watch it because the story's good and the characters are great. So we're not actually realizing that we're taking in all this information about crisis and death. You think of all the firefighter shows and all of these shows are focused on death, crisis, houses burning down, whatever it is. So we're constantly being conditioned into a fear state. When our minds watch an image of a catastrophe, whether it's real or not, your body and mind react as if it's real. And I don't think most people realize that. I'd been channeling for a year at that point. and I had a very boring job doing commercial sewing, but it was perfect because I had all of this crazy stuff happening in my personal life, channeling the first book and all of that, and getting used to channeling. And they had made me move. So I had been living in Victoria, Canada, and when Ananda first started to speak through me, which was about 3 months after the first energy encounter, they said, we want you to move November 1st. And they told me this October 15th. So I was like, November 1st? And they said, yes, November 1st. And I was like, well, I can't. And they're like, and they would not say anything else. They just said, you need to move, you need to move. If you can't get it in your car, you give it away. And it was pretty intense, but I was fully surrendered to this crazy experience I was having. So I moved back to Salt Spring Island, where I live now, which is about an hour from Victoria. The reason they wanted me there November 1st was a friend of mine, her daughter went into an early labor and she had to go for 4 months. So her house was empty. So there was a house for me there because they didn't want me to get a job, right? And then it turned out the place I'd worked part-time before sewing was hiring somebody part-time November 1st. So they had me back November 1st. I had a house and a job. That was why it was like, you got to go now. You got to go now. So then I was kind of set. I had a house. I wasn't paying rent. I didn't have, I don't know. I was a part-time job. I wasn't making very much money. And that's what I was doing when the second book came through. So the story about how that initiated is actually very interesting. My sister's friend had died suddenly. And she was very upset about it and she kept crying. I said, well, come over. I'd done a lot of sessions with her, with Ananda. And she came over and I said, well, let's see what Ananda has to say. They'll have some wisdom for you. And just before she got to the house, Ananda came through and said, Malcolm wants to speak. And Malcolm was the guy who just died. So at this point, I've only channeled Ananda, right? I don't know anything about any other people coming through. But I knew Malcolm. So I was like, okay, sure, And so when my sister arrived, I said, you'll never guess who wants to talk to you. So she came in, I channeled Malcolm for about 45 minutes, very strong English accent, very funny. He said he died and he said it felt like he was falling through the floor of his apartment, but he was spending lots of time with his mum. They're both English, having lots of cups of tea and talking to each other. So she left with a smile on her face and she was happy. And then Ananda said, there's a long line of beings who want to talk. They have a message for the world. Will you let them speak? It's a book. It's going to be a book. So what Ananda said was that because I had willingly channeled someone else, that they kind of like put their foot in the door and said, okay, she's willing to do this now. Are you willing to do this? So I said yes. And for 20 days in 1 month, I'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I didn't know who would come through. And it was amazing, but it was about number 15. So they said there'd be 20. And about number 15, I just started saying to myself, I wonder who the 20th is going to be. Just don't be Jesus. Just don't be Jesus. So I kept saying that, just don't, of course it was him. And he said Jesus-y things, love your enemy and stuff like that. And then the next morning he came through and said, I want you to write my autobiography. But first you have to read the New Testament. So I have channeled fairies. I was walking in the woods one day with my son and I sat on a bench and I was like, oh, someone wants to say something. And there was a fairy talking about how loud humans are in the woods and they stomp around and they're angry and very difficult to be around. And they told me that if I ever had any property that I should leave a wild area for them and not cultivate the whole thing. I've channeled extraterrestrial beings. I've channeled Ashtar, and I channeled a woman called Solara, I think her name was. And she said that she was a psychologist on a large spaceship that was observing Earth. She came through in the early days. Who else have I channeled? The Arcturians. The Guardians came through a few years ago on Salt Spring. And they talked as if they were sort of innovators of human life on Earth. Very old, scientists, I guess. Often the other beings will come through when I'm doing retreats. when I'm, you know, immersed in that environment for a few days. Yeah, it's very entertaining. They send their guidance to me through feelings, and they don't, and extreme interest. So if they say, if you're really interested in something, that's us telling you to dive into that subject. So for example, for 4 years before COVID, I was obsessively learning about vaccines, and I didn't know why. I couldn't stop listening to videos, information, research, and it was just constant. And then when the whole COVID thing happened, I was like, oh, that's why they were doing that. So right now I'm obsessed with pottery. So that's the next thing, and I don't question. So that's how they say. Jesus has spontaneously channeled a couple of times to tell me something. One time I was at my sister's house and we were making plans to go to Mexico or something, and I got in the car and he came through and he said, you can cancel that, you're going to be busy doing something else. So I was like, okay, but that's very rare. That's very rare. So I have a completely ordinary consciousness. I'm not hearing voices all the time. I'm not getting guidance all the time other than through my own feelings. So that's really how they work through me. And I really make sure that I'm living my own life as well. That's been a real priority for me, that I'm not just, you know, like a nun, just dedicated to religion. I want to evolve myself. And I think that's one of the things I see clearly, is that the Course in Miracles helped me evolve out of a really judgmental mind. But I have things that I want to do as Tina. So I kind of, it's a really beautiful cooperative venture in that way, you know, so this job, right? So, but one of the things I try and do is just balance my life, so that, because I felt like it would be very easy to get burnt out doing this. I was actually listening to a Jane Roberts audiobook recently, and Seth told Jane that he didn't want her to do more than 3 sessions a week. And she died young. She died when she was like 53 or something. And obviously it was, you know, she died of, I think, arthritis, like rheumatoid arthritis, like it's a very difficult time she had. So I've always had that in my mind, to look after my health, look after my interests as well. But this work has just, it's got its own momentum. So there's things that have to be done, and I love it. And I'm very fortunate now at this stage. You know, when I was writing the books, all I did was I had my part-time job and I channeled the books and transcribed the books. For 5 years, I didn't do anything else. So I've had these periods where I'm just like completely dedicated to it. So now I have more freedom. It's sort of evolved into, I have the online community, the Channeling Jesus community on Mighty Networks, and I do regular live streams for that. And we do retreats. We do retreats all over the world for people who've discovered us on YouTube, and who are part, a lot of the members fill up the retreat spaces. But that's amazing, you know, going to different countries and meeting people from all over the world. It's really an amazing thing. And then that's where I hear, you know, the stories of this work changing people's lives. It's incredible. I just started reading the course one day. That was it. And I had no idea where it was going to go. A Course in Miracles is the true teachings of Jesus without the church and human interference. That's all it is. It's a beautiful book that describes how your mind works, how your ego works, why we're here, why this world looks so crazy. You know, if God is loving, why there are wars? If God is love, why do children die of cancer when they're 4? It doesn't make any sense. And when I first read the course, it was the only book that ever made sense of everything. And I didn't read anything else for 4 years. When I first found the course, that was it. I was like, well, it's pointless reading anything else. Everything's in here. So it's the true teachings of Jesus. He's the voice of the course. He's the teacher. And I didn't know that when I started. It wasn't until he made some reference to his crucifixion that I was like, whoa, hang on a second. This is the voice of Jesus in the book. And that sounds wild and crazy, but when you think about it, if he is this benevolent master teacher, he's not limited by the body. That is what he was teaching. The body is not real. Death is not real. And so, well, it makes sense that he would channel and communicate because he's not limited by the physical body. And anybody that thinks, well, it's Jesus, he wouldn't be talking to you, I'd be like, well, no, he overcame the physical. That's what the whole resurrection was about. The church concentrates more on the crucifixion, suffering and sacrifice. But in actual fact, he was teaching that he had mastered his mind and overcome the physical world. So the physical world doesn't require him to have a body to communicate. That's kind of how I look at it, right? A year of forgiveness. So 2019, I decided tomorrow, it was December 31st, I thought, I'm going to start reading the lessons online tomorrow. It was no bigger a plan than that. I didn't even think about what it would be like to do 365 videos. So the next morning I started reading the lesson and I said, okay, well, let's see what Jesus has to say about this lesson. So he channeled, and then I did the next day and I said, well, maybe he's got something to say about this. So sure enough, he had something to say about the second lesson. So every day he would have a commentary, and basically the commentary is a sort of practical application, clarification of the lesson. What does this lesson mean in your regular life? How can I help you understand it? And so I did the 365 days, and he channeled every single day. And the transcriptions of those commentaries is what a year of forgiveness is. So it's a book to have with your Course in Miracles. So you've got your Course in Miracles, you're reading the lessons, you're like, well, this doesn't make any sense. What the heck does this mean? Okay, there's a commentary from Jesus to help you understand. And the way I look at this ministry that he's working through me is it's a bridge between a Course in Miracles and ordinary Western people. Because the Course is so esoteric and it's so difficult to read, and it's pure non-dualism, which doesn't really help you when you're living in duality. Duality is very different than living a non-dual experience, but these teachings are kind of a bridge between the two. So he's helping you decide, what do you eat? My mum's getting old and she needs to go into a home, but I can't afford it and nobody will help me. What do I do? And it's more practical, right? So he's giving practical advice for the Western mind in particular. It's designed for the Western mind because we're all conditioned the same. Like, we all think we're individuals and we all think we're different, but we've all got this. There's about 10 problems Western people have. It's money, it's your work, it's sexual relationships, it's family, it's your appearance, it's aging, it's the government. There's about 10 things. Then all of us have the same problems. And through this ministry, what I've come to see is that we're so heavily conditioned that we think we're free and we're not. And this is what the Course is. It's a manual for the most powerful device in the universe, which is the human mind. We are manufacturing and creating our world. That was an idea. Everything was an idea, right? You have long hair. There's a reason you have long hair. It means something to you. It's a conditioning program. It's something that you think of as a choice, but really, is it a choice? Who taught you that? So it's a breaking free of conditioning, and that is why I think our planet's in such trouble. It's why we aren't reaching our potential, because we aren't free, and we have to free our minds, and that's really what it is. So it's a beautiful book. Holds the frequency of love and freedom and creativity, and I don't think there's anybody on this planet that wouldn't benefit from it. At all. Yeah. I don't think I'd be alive without it. I mean, where I was mentally and emotionally and physically 22 years ago when it came to me, I don't think I'd be alive. And I meet a lot of people who've been doing A Course in Miracles for years, and they've said, I never really got it until I started listening to him. I never really understood it. Like there was some key that's being given with this work. Yeah, and it's 50 years old. I mean, you think of all the changes that have happened just in, let's say, technology in the last few years. The people who are designing those things know. It's common knowledge, but it's obviously absent that we're not taught this stuff in school. It's like nobody teaches you this, and this is exactly, emotional intelligence, psychology, how the mind functions, how addictions work. All of those things are things that everyone should be educated about, but they aren't. It's screamingly absent. When you're constantly taking that kind of traumatic information into your mind, you're going down and down in frequency into that limbic survival mode, which is very, very primitive. And one of the side effects of that being in that frequency is looking to authority for solutions. What I see is that the people who had trained their minds could see what was happening because they knew they could recognize it as mind training. They're like, this is propaganda, but they'd been doing the work in their own minds to master their own minds. So they weren't in that low frequency victim limbic brain kind of place. They had raised themselves up over it. So the information was coming in at that low frequency, but if you're here, it can't reach you. You've got to be down here for that terrifying information to reach you. So if you master your mind, then you can say no. Good. Just so you know, I never did read your questions. I usually just go into things blind because I'm fine. I love talking about this. There's so much, the history of this and the experience is just, it's a true story. I don't need to prep. It's from the heart. It's just what happened, Well, the history of the course itself is fascinating. I was studying the course before I was a channeler, so I kind of read the biography of the lady who channeled it, and she was not happy about it. I was not happy about it at first. I'm like, really? You've got to be kidding me, Jesus? But her story is very fascinating. Helen Schuckman, she was a psychologist, and she'd had a lot of kind of religious experiences and stuff as a kid, but she considered herself an atheist. And she was in an environment that was very, very combative in a university in New York. And the staff were always fighting each other. And at some point, she and one of her co-workers said, there must be a better way. And that is that's the door where Jesus comes in. When you're doing what you've been trained to do, you're doing your best, and it's not working, whether it's, your second divorce or you keep working hard and you've got no money, and you go, oh, there must be a better way than what I'm doing. And that really is the moment your mind becomes teachable. So for her and the co-worker, she started to hear this voice in her head who had this text that he wanted to, and the only time he would shut up is if she wrote it. So she came up with the shorthand, and her co-worker started typing it up and writing it down. And it took her 7 years to do this, and she was not happy about it the whole time. And Jesus, in the unedited versions of the course, her relationship with Jesus is talked about in the beginning, where she wanted to buy a fur coat, and he said, just let me tell you where to buy it. It will save you a lot of time, and then we can get back to work. Because he was like, you're wasting time shopping. I can tell you where your coat is. But it's a very, very fascinating relationship that she had with him. And so Jesus is a loving being, right? I think this idea that he is above us, in the course he's very clear. He's like, I'm your older brother. And in the Bible even it says, everything I can do, you can do too. He's very clear about that, right? He's not saying, I'm so special, you'll never be like me. He says, you can be just like me. But that's not what the church has emphasized, right? It's his specialness. He's the only Son of God. You can never be like him. He's perfect. And that's a lie. That's not what he taught. Jesus, as a loving, enlightened being, would want everybody to stop suffering and learn to become empowered too. And that's what he's doing. I have no doubt that if he showed up in physical form, he would be put in a mental institution, or he would be declared a terrorist or whatever. I don't know. So he's transmitting his teachings in a way that can get to everybody without any persecution. Although when I first started, I did find out I was scared of the Catholic Church when he first came through. And I didn't know I was until he asked me to write his autobiography. And I was like, oh, because he told me to take 24 hours to think about it. And I was like, okay. And I thought about it for 3 or 4 hours. And then I was like, I never wanted a boring life anyway. I'll do it. It's this idea of the physical body, you know, him not communicating with humans implies that he needs to be in a physical body, and that's the exact opposite of what he taught. It's really an inverted thought system to think that he would not communicate with people. Of course he does. What he has said, what Jesus has said, is that the ascension process is happening. So it's an elevation of frequency, and it's an evolution of consciousness that's going to happen, and that the only thing that can happen to stop it, it can't be stopped, but it can be slowed down a bit. And that it's, let's say everybody started to study A Course in Miracles and started to practice forgiveness and refuse to attack people and all of that stuff that it teaches. This planet would be transformed in a year. There would be nobody would go to war. The people who are flying the drones would say, I'm not flying the drone. Like it would all stop. So these people in positions of power, now I don't know what the hierarchy is or who's in the hierarchy, but clearly this constant barrage of fear, propaganda to push separation.